All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Enabling Value featuring InfoEd Global. I'm Kimberly Iniger, Events and Outreach Specialist at ORCID. Now, before we get started today, I'd like to bring your attention to some features available during the webinar to enhance your experience. The first is closed captioning and translated captions. These features allow you to enable audio captions and translate those captions into a few different languages. To enable, click on the Show Captions button in your Zoom toolbar. We also have a dedicated Q&A channel, and we invite you to submit your questions throughout the session. To do so, click on the Q&A button in the Zoom toolbar. You can also view questions and other attendees have submitted, upvote questions you're interested in, and add comments. We have some helpful documentation available to assist you in accessing these features, which is available in the Resources tab in the Zoom toolbar. Finally, this session is being recorded, and the recording, along with the session materials, will be shared after the session. So today we are joined by Roger Wood from InfoEd Global, along with Sigrid Kelsey and Dr. Stephen David Beck from Louisiana State University. More information about today's speakers is available in the Resources tab. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Roger to begin our presentation today.
Thanks, Kimberly. So welcome, everybody. Let me see if I can get my slides going, which is always a little bit of a challenge. Okay, I believe that you folks are all seeing my slides now. Is that right, Kimberly?
Yep, it looks great.
Great. Okay, so so again, thanks for inviting us to come today and do this presentation. We'll talk a little bit about how Louisiana State University is sort of leveraging ORCID, and we'll spend a little time talking about how InfoEd Global has built-in support for ORCID into our application. So first, by way of just sort of getting us all started, I have a couple of intro slides up to just sort of tell us about ORCID itself. So obviously we all kind of are somewhat aware of ORCID, but the key elements, I think, are that it tracks researchers. It's designed for its profiles to track researchers over time across systems and throughout their career. And a key thing that ORCID does is helps us identify one investigator, investigators from each other, even if they may have the same names or have the same names and work at the same institution, which happens a lot. And of course, in the end, the goal is to reduce administrative burden. And conceptually, the way it works is that users, individuals, set up and maintain a profile in ORCID, and that profile contains CV-type data. Now, happily and conveniently for all of us, the ORCID profile can source data from a number of locations. So users can manually enter data. Data can be entered using the ORCID API by publishers and funders and other institutions. And that's where InfoEd's implementation of the ORCID API comes into play. Importantly, individual users, investigators who are maintaining their profile in ORCID have control over the visibility of data in their profile. So they can share the data and or allow data to be updated based on controls that you see here, where it can be everyone, trusted parties. This is visibility of the data, or only visible to themselves. But obviously, trusted parties is kind of an important concept, or everyone, in the world of trying to share your ORCID profile data. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Kelsey, to Sigrid, who will, I know too many people named Kelsey, and
happens all the time.
begin talking, telling us a little bit about Louisiana State.
Okay, yeah, so I'm Sigrid Kelsey, Head of Scholarly Publications and Analytics at the LSU Libraries, and my department's work includes, among other things, multiple approaches to increasing ORCID adoption across campus. We assist researchers with their ORCID profiles and other scholarly identities by importing publication citations into their profiles for them when possible, and advising them on strategies they can take themselves. In a recent email, LSU's provost mentioned the library's ORCID services as a counterexample of red tape and bureaucracy. So our ORCID work started with setting up an ORCID at lsu.edu email address and offering to connect faculty's ORCIDs to Scopus, Crossref, and other sources. And we use the trusted individual feature in ORCID with faculty members making one of our team a trusted individual. As a library, we focus on the publications or works section of each profile, which we consider to be the library-related section. So because we are not looking at the funding section or other parts, this implementation by the LSU Office of Research and Development, or ORCID, and InfoEd really expands on the university-wide efforts in this area. And ORCID has already been instrumental in helping with communications about our service. They've included information in regular broadcast email messages that go out to all faculty members about the NSF mandate to use ScienceCV. The email messages inform faculty that they can populate ScienceCV from ORCID, and further that the library can populate their ORCID profiles for them. And because ScienceCV only allows users to import publications from either ORCID or NCBI My Bibliography, and does not allow them to be added manually, our ORCID service has been in demand. Our direct work with ScienceCV has been limited, mostly just fielding questions about technical glitches, which seem to happen from time to time. Also, we found ORCID is easier to use and has much broader applications than My Bibliography from NCBI, but we also provide some help with My Bibliography if asked. So the library's project has been successful so far. One gap that we have is that when a publication citation is not available from a trusted source like Scopus, that's more often the case in the humanities, especially for books, book chapters, and book reviews. We add those citations manually as the ORCID profile's trusted individual. So those citations lack that trust label that would be ideal. We're working with the Information Technology Services Unit at LSU to hopefully implement the API that would allow the library to update the work section of a researcher's ORCID profile in a way that would list LSU libraries as the source. Once that's implemented, a next step might be to allow the library or ORCID to update other sections of a profile to create those trust labels elsewhere in the profiles. So, and Roger will speak more about those trust labels in a little bit, I think. So basically, that's just a little bit about what the libraries has been doing to encourage and assist with ORCID adoption. And I guess I'd be willing to field any questions now or maybe at the end.
We'll definitely hold time for Q&A at the end of the
Okay.
session. So as we continue through the presentation, audience, as you have questions, please feel free to submit them to the Q&A.
Yeah, that's all I had. So Roger, can you go to the next slide?
So the next slide will be Dr. Beck is going to talk a little bit about, whoops, if I can get there, say a little bit more about the research administration aspect at LSU. Dr. Beck, you might be muted.
And of course, being the audio guy in the group, it's always up to me to have my mic muted. I'm sorry about that. Thanks, Roger, and thanks, Sigrid. We have been working very closely with LSU Libraries and Sigrid for quite some time on trying to find ways for us to better facilitate the way our faculty can document their work for a variety of purposes. As research security programs and protocols are starting to be developed and guidelines being made, being put forward by federal agencies, it's more important than ever for research administrators to become a trusted source for faculty, so that when they submit current and pending and other support documentation, that they can have a trusted source that they can draw from to make sure that they have all the materials that they need. And that's one of the things that we're most excited about, this integration between ORCID and InfoEd, which is our ERA platform. Two areas that are really most important for us. One is the biographical information, publication data that comes out of the libraries. The other is the award data, the proposal data, and any other contribution, any other support that could be documented in our system could be eventually piped into ORCID profiles automatically. And that for us is really a critical thing. I think that as these research security protocols focus significantly on financial conflicts of interest, financial contributions, financial support from foreign sources, it's more important than ever that we make sure that faculty have the data that they need. And so for us, the opportunity to take our pre-award data, populate it into profiles, take award data, populate that into profiles, and to have that data available as a trusted source for us it just means that our faculty are going to be better prepared as they submit their proposals and submit their disclosures, especially as current pendings may become an annual disclosure because of some of the requirements between NSPM 33 and CHIPS and Science Act. That's really our strategy. I mean, we've really been focused on having a clear way to disambiguate faculty, to have their records be unique and complete, and servicing their needs both for submission of proposals, as well as just general information about faculty. Using ORCID as a source for that is something that we think is really the way forward for us, and it will be a central part of our strategy as the new integrations get rolled out and put into the system. And we'll be using it just as soon as we are fully engaged with that. So, and I'll be happy to answer any questions on our strategy and on research security. I know Roger's going to talk a little bit about that moving forward. So, Roger?
Great. Thank you. All right. So these next few slides are going to actually demonstrate the way our ORCID integration works within InfoEd. It all starts out with making things visible to your users. So when a user logs into InfoEd, they end up in what we call the portal, the user portal. And so we've designed a widget, which is kind of the way that information is presented to users in the portal that can be activated. They can also do it directly in their profile, but this makes it a little easier and more visible. And you can see, here in the top left, what it looks like before they've actually connected to their ORCID profile, their InfoEd instance to their ORCID profile. And then once they do, it will show their ID value here. It's a link, would open their public profiles screen, and then also lists the data that's going to be exchanged, the data exchange that's going to be activated through the API. And I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slides. They also can revoke their authorization of the institution through that same widget or through their profile. So this is the configuration that supports activating the ORCID API. And the details are probably not terribly important here, except to say that you can request credentials to use the API if you need to, or you can use pre-existing credentials if you already have those through ORCID. So those come from ORCID. They get then entered into this configuration area. We do support both the ORCID production system and the ORCID sandbox system, so that you can use the sandbox for testing if you want. And we then give granular control to the institution to establish which parts of users' profiles do actually or are engaged in that data transfer process. And the sections that are potentially able to be activated are the employment section of the profile, the InfoEd user profile, which we call Genius profile. So that's what the word genius means there. The education section, award data, which goes into the funding section of the ORCID profile. And then also we support retrieving citation data back from users' ORCID profiles into their InfoEd profiles. So that's the kind of the opposite of what when Sigrid was saying that they are looking to push publication and citation data, works data into ORCID profiles. So we're we have not yet at least been asked to activate that from InfoEd, although that certainly could be done as well. So as part of this, for any of those sections that you want to push data to ORCID, you have to map sponsors for funding and also the other sections, and I'll hit those in a minute, to ROR, which stands for the Research Organization Registry, unique identifiers of those organizations. So basically, we've enabled a way to do that right within our system, so that you, and this is an administrative feature for sponsors at least, you can search, click this search link, which will open the ROR search screen. It will automatically search for the institution whose name is there. When you find the right one, there'll be several showed up, listed usually. You click select, and that will bring the, in this case, the sponsor's ROR ID back in. And the ROR ID is important to have because when we push data to the user's ORCID profile, that's how the sponsor is actually identified formally. And you can see in an ORCID profile here where the ROR ID is displayed, along with other information that that identifies, in this case, University of Delaware as an institution. So this is a little bit of a mix because it starts with sponsors and ends up with an institution, but it's ultimately the same thing. So if you're pushing award data, your sponsors have to be mapped to their ROR IDs. And I'm going to talk about the other sections in just a moment. But I wanted to take just a moment to talk about trust labels and data sources. Sigrid mentioned this in her presentation earlier, and it's important to understand that investigators, as I said earlier, can edit their own data, or as Sigrid said, a trusted party, a librarian who's set up as a trusted party for an investigator, can manually edit their profile data. When that's done, the source of the data, each data element has a source, and the source will be identified as that person. But when things are configured to allow either your institution through InfoEd, or as Sigrid mentioned, they're working to do separately from LSU for works data, you'll see a different source show up. And you'll see in many of the next few slides, InfoEd Global will show up as the source. And that's because these are all, I've mostly used records of my own where either I'm the source personally, or where InfoEd Global will show up as the source, and that's where you would see your institution's name. But you'll also see lots of other sources. These are just a random few that I pulled from profiles across, but there are lots of potential sources. The key difference here is this green check mark, which is the trust label that sort of suggests that you can, not to say that investigators or other trusted parties managing their profiles are not trustworthy. They certainly are. But you get an extra layer of trustworthiness when an institution has put the data there. And that's what the green check mark demonstrates. So then I talked a moment ago about the sponsored funding data and how sponsors had to be mapped to their ROR IDs. You can also choose, an institution can choose to push employment data from their InfoEd profiles to their ORCID profiles. And in that case, again, the ROR mapping is necessary for each of these each employer in the system. And then you'll see the trust label when that data is asserted, saying that it was put there by InfoEd Global. Similarly, for education, kind of works the same way. You can choose to activate pushing education data from profiles to ORCID. And again, if you do, it'll say that it was pushed there by your institution. And again, those institutions have to have ROR mapping done in order for those to link up correctly. This is the funding data. It's a little bit different in the sense that each institution's definition of how they track pending applications and awards and closed awards as well in InfoEd's proposal tracking module varies. And so what we've done is allowed them to build a report that then they map to certain fields that are defined as part of the ORCID API. And this is all just done right in our built-in reporting tool. And then once that's mapped, and then that mapped report is selected in the configuration area, which you kind of see a little snippet of up here on the right, then once a day, usually, basically a report will be run. This report will be run. It will gather up all the data for that meets the parameters defined in the report, which is essentially awarded records in your system, and then we'll push those data to the ORCID profiles for researchers who have authorized that connection to happen. And when they do that, when that happens, again, the data will show up here. It will have the institution, the funder will be identified because it's got that sponsor ROR mapping that we talked about earlier. And the assertion coming from your institution will show up down here as well. And then finally, works data from the ORCID profile. The citations there can be retrieved into the user's InfoEd profile if desired. And the key really here is that each institution can pick and choose among these which elements they want to, from between the profiles they want to push and or pull. So some institutions might choose only to push funding data and let the employment and education and citation data take care of itself, if you will. Some may want to retrieve citation data so that they can use that for things internally. So exactly which elements get activated at an institution is a local choice. So that's kind of explains how it works and how it's configured. And then I thought it might be useful to spend just a couple of minutes talking about, why have we done this? What motivated InfoEd to build this support out now? We've had for a long time, several years, we've had support to allow for connecting ORCID profiles to InfoEd profiles, but we have only just now built out the full support for the ORCID API, and so that choice was driven largely by Dr. Beck mentioned this earlier as one of the motivations as well at Louisiana, NSPM 33. I don't want to bore you with a lot of details and timelines and so forth, but there are a couple of important elements. NSPM 33 in the guidance document, which is what I actually have a picture of there, that came out almost 2 years ago now, says that, as you can see here, that researchers should be registered with a service that provides a digital persistent identifier. ORCID is a service that provides digital persistent identifiers for individuals. Likewise, agencies should standardize their forms for both initial disclosures and annual updates using digital persistent identifiers where appropriate and practicable. What that means is they should collect the DPI or the ORCID ID in this case. That's kind of what we're talking about, to have that for disambiguation purposes across the government. And eventually, the goal is that research agencies should allow submission of required disclosure information using a DPI service, so a link. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute, and we'll see where that might come into play. So the primary goal of, one of the primary goals, so certainly not the only one, research security is probably the overarching goal of NSPM 33. But another goal of NSPM 33 is to reduce administrative burden. And the way that is expected to sort of happen is through the use of common forms. That there are two common forms that are involved here. One relates to biosketches and the other to current and pending other support. So today, agencies have their own forms or formats that they publish for collecting these kinds of data. Some have one form, some have distinct forms for those two bits of data. Some are similar across agencies, but they're rarely the same. So there's a kind of a lot of the same information has to be put into a bunch of different formats or forms to be able to support different kinds of applications to different agencies. And so that's obviously a significant administrative burden for faculty and research administrators. And so the goal is to have common forms that would be used by all agencies, so that even though the data may change from application to application to some extent, at least the form and format of the data won't. So they won't have to relearn, what a term means between agencies. The terminology will be standardized, and the presentations, the form data will be, the form output will be standardized. In the future, and those common forms should be rolling out any day now. Probably by the end of the year, we'll hear more information about that. They're not available quite yet, although there are drafts of those that have been published. So the link to a DPI service is, as I said before, aspirational, a future goal, not something that we should expect to see coming anytime in the immediate future. So it's important to think a little bit about how the data that's available in an ORCID profile merges with or marries to the data requirements for the common forms under NSPM 33. And there are some gaps. For biosketches, the data that's needed for the common forms is all there. But there are some things that are maybe not supported fully or as nicely as maybe it would be ideal, in the sense that biosketches cannot be tailored, or profile views in ORCID cannot be tailored to reflect the way biosketches have to be individualized for each application. So that is not expected to change in terms of a requirement. The expectation is that while the biosketches sketch format will be consistent, the data, can still be expected to be different from one application to another. So ORCID profiles, of course, are consistent. You can't save iterations of your ORCID profile, or if you will. So that is something that we will see how that rolls out. And then agencies, certainly NSF in their implementation today, require that investigators certify the data in their biosketch and current and pending support is accurate and complete. And there isn't really a way to certify an ORCID profile. But of course, they could include a certification language, if you will, in the application for the investigator to say that they are certifying it. So there are ways around that. But so for biosketches, the data is there. It's just a question of how best to use those data for these common forms. And for current and pending other support forms, some of the data is there, but some of the data that's needed for those forms is not actually tracked in an ORCID profile. And this is a short list, and I'm going to mention this list again on another slide in a couple of minutes. But basically, perhaps one of the biggest gaps, if you will, is pending application data. So ORCID profiles are designed to hold what is essentially public data. Whether the user makes it public or not is a different question, but it is public data. And U.S. federal agencies don't consider pending application information public. That's proprietary information. So as a result, ORCID doesn't track pending application information. Other information that's needed for the current and pending form that's not tracked in ORCID is the investigator effort for each period of an application or award, and then there's a statement of overlap. And I've got a slide, not the next one, but shortly, that sort of does some mapping, illustrates some mapping there to help us understand that better. So this is where this another system, ScienceCV, can come into play. And I just have a couple slides to help us understand what ScienceCV is and where it fits in. So ScienceCV is a joint project. It's actually run out of National Institutes of Health by the NCBI group within National Library of Medicine. It was originally a project, a joint project between them and the Federal Demonstration Partnership. Users can link their ORCID profile as well as their agency profiles to the their ScienceCV record, if you will, their account in ScienceCV. And I'm using that term a little carefully because ScienceCV does not store a profile. ScienceCV records are forms-based. So a user has an account in ScienceCV, but everything that they create there or store there is a form. Originally, it was designed to deal with biosketches. They've expanded support to include the current and pending other support form for NSF And I think we all expect that that other agencies will begin to use it for the current and pending other support forms as well. As I said, data from ORCID profiles can be imported. They also support other sources. You can see on the right side there, ERA Commons profiles can be a data source. NSF profiles can be a data source. And when you're talking about the works kind of information, the citation data for publications and other kinds of, as ORCID calls them, works, or products, as they're called in Science CV lingo, they can be sourced from NCBI as well. So support for the common forms is under development at Science CV today. And presumably, whenever those common forms actually are formally rolled out, there will be support in Science CV for being able to generate a biosketch or a current and pending other support form in the appropriate format that would be used. So now let's talk a little bit more about those the mapping between an ORCID profile and a Science CV record. So ORCID profile on the left, an example of a funding record in an ORCID profile, and then what they call a project or proposal record in the Science CV. In Science CV is shown on the right, and the fields that are highlighted in green map over from an ORCID profile fine. The title, the award number, and the sponsor, and objectives, and so forth. To the extent that those data are in the ORCID user's ORCID profile funding record, those will map over fine. But the things that are highlighted in yellow are gaps. These are elements that are not stored in an ORCID profile today, and probably not going to be stored in an ORCID profile in the future, because they don't represent data that is sort of usually tracked at ORCID. In the context of ORCID, it's either not public data, the pending information, or it's effort, year by year planned effort within the context of a given award, and that's just a level of detail that is sort of not really relevant to an ORCID profile itself. And so ultimately, Science CV can create the forms, but it needs to get the data from somewhere. And Science CV, as we said earlier, can get data from an ORCID profile. It can get data from agency systems, and it can also, or it will, because they're working on this, but it's not available today, can get data from an institution's ERA system directly. And users can manually enter most data into their Science CV forms as well. I didn't include that in the graph there, but manual data entry for everything except for publications and works type data is possible. And ultimately then in Science CV, as I said, everything is forms based. So a user has a library of forms that show up when they log in that they can work with or copy, or create new blank forms, and identify different sources of data. They can then certify, the investigator can certify as to the completeness and accuracy of the data, and then a PDF document can be output. And that PDF document then, with the appropriate certification by the investigator, can be downloaded and then uploaded in an application wherever that application is being submitted through, whether it's Grants.gov's workspace or an S2S system like InfoEd, or Assist at NIH, or Research.gov for NSF, or Inspires for NASA, or whatever. Those forms then can be uploaded into those systems, and we'll meet whatever the requirements are of the common forms, potentially the agency. Now, I didn't specifically call this out, but it is possible for agencies to include additional requirements above and beyond what is included in the common forms. That's not to say that they can change the common forms. They are not expected to be able to do that. But they can have additional requirements above and beyond what's required by the common forms. And exactly how those additions will be implemented is not it's not been published yet. Although I think the expectation is it will be an additional document that the agency would require. But again, we'll have to see how that really rolls out. So that actually concludes my slides. This is this last slide. I don't expect that you'll glean the information from here, but the slides will be available shortly. Kimberly will help us make sure that the slides are available, and there's contact information for each of us there if you would like to reach out and ask questions. You'll note that our ORCID profiles are linked here as well. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Kimberly to deal with questions.
Thanks so much, Roger, and also thank you to Dr. Beck and to Sigrid for your presentation today. We really appreciate you guys giving your time to us today. We've received quite a few questions, but we do have just about 17 minutes for Q&A. So audience, the questions that you have, please feel free to send them our way so we can get you those answers. Sigrid, the first question was addressed to you. It says, I am interested to know how many individuals, maybe represented by an FTE, are working on your ORCID service locally. Also, what skill sets have you found to be useful for this service?
Okay, so by ORCID service, I'm going to focus on just faculty being able to designate us as a trusted individual to update the works. I'm not going to talk about the ITS work or what Stephen is doing. So we have myself and then one person in my department, a full-time librarian, who monitors the ORCID inbox and responds to faculty who say, will you help me? And then we give them instructions how to designate one of us as a trusted individual. It only takes a few minutes to connect them to Scopus or Crossref or something like that. So it really hasn't taken up a lot of extra time for us. Every once in a while, we get follow-up questions. A faculty member might send us their CV and want us to enter things that aren't available in a trusted source. And when that happens, we've generally been saying yes, if it's okay with you, if we make our student a trusted individual. We have a really smart and accurate student, and we haven't been told no yet, and so we can hand that over to a student to type in the citations, and then we'll let the faculty member know, make sure all of this is accurate. So yeah, just a very small team, but so far it has not been at all overwhelming. As far as skill sets, I don't know. I mean, just a familiarity with Scopus and Crossref and making connections, but it's not complicated to do once you figure it out and do it a few times. So
Thanks for that, Sigrid. I know we often get questions about how, as institutions begin their journey with ORCID, how they can develop their teams around that to ensure that they have the appropriate amount of support. Our next question, Roger, is does the exchange of data, specifically the ROR profile, require us to use InfoEd for proposals/awards, or can we consume our list of sponsors from another system and send them in?
Well, the InfoEd's integration with ORCID assumes that the data are going to be sourced from within InfoEd's system, and for the funding data, that would be from our proposal tracking module. So the award data would have to exist in the proposal tracking module. Sponsor information can be manually managed within InfoEd, or can be sourced through a separate integration if you have another source of truth for sponsors externally. And if that other source of truth for your sponsor data tracks ROR IDs, those could also be pulled directly into InfoEd. So you wouldn't necessarily have to manage the sponsors directly in InfoEd, or do the ROR mapping for the sponsors in InfoEd, but it has to be done somewhere. And the data then would have to get into InfoEd somehow, so that it would be available along with the award information in InfoEd to push out to ORCID.
Very helpful. Thank you, Roger. And then our next question, I think, will direct towards some ORCID staff. I've got two lovely staff members on with me, both Shavindra and Shauna. And the question is, can InfoEd be integrated with the ORCID member API, or only configuration with the public API is possible?
Actually, I can answer that one.
Oh.
Because it's basically what we did. So we do have integrations. The integration is available with both. However, for the public API, we only support connect, profile connection. So we don't support data exchange via the public API. That's only available using the member API, which is how it's designed with ORCID, from ORCID as well. So you can establish just the connection using the public API if that's what the institution would like to do.
And then Shauna or Shiv, was there anything either of you wanted to add? You guys are there.
Yeah, no, I think what Roger said is complete. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Okay, moving along. Roger, this one is for you, and it's a couple of questions. So I'll read them through, but let me know if you need any part of it again. It says, what release of InfoEd will this be available? I'm not sure what they mean by this. So if the submitter of this question could clarify that, that'd be great. But the next part of the question
I know
is,
what he means.
Okay. Is there a professional service fee for pulling ORCID data into InfoEd profiles? And is there a professional service fee for pushing data into ORCID?
Sure. Great questions, Danny. Thanks. This is very InfoEd centric questions. The question just went away. I was actually looking at it and reading it. So the simple answer is there's no fee no additional fee to implement the ORCID integration, either pushing or pulling of data once you have InfoEd environment going. There's just additional configurations that are set up. So there's no fee, unless you need help from our professional services team to do that, but broadly you won't need that. And this is actually going to be available in our next release. So our software goes through sort of periodic release cycles, like all software does. And our next release is called, we have numbers for them, it's 15.902. 03 is our next release coming out towards the end of the year, and that's the release that this is included in.
Thanks, Roger. Our next question is for the LSU team. Roger, you could probably add to it as well, but is LSU currently storing any data in InfoEd from ORCID?
So I'm actually not the best person to answer that question. I think Roger actually might know it better, but I know that the strategy that we're trying to use is to use the integration so that LSU can be a trusted source for data on behalf of faculty. So I think at a minimum, we'd probably store some of the ORCID numbers and some basic data just for correlation. But if I'm correct, I think as sponsored programs is pulling some data, but we're really mostly going to be pushing data. Roger?
That would be my guess for most clients, LSU and most other clients, that the primary feature that I think folks will want to activate just to streamline things for building current and pending other support documents is to push award data to ORCID profile so that that can then be sourced to pull into Science CV. The other elements, education, employment, that you can push, I think I think most institutions may choose not to do that, or some may choose to do that. But in concert with limiting what data they allow users to put into those sections of their InfoEd profiles. And likewise, on the retrieval of citation data into the InfoEd profile, I think that's going to be very institution by institution, just depending upon if they'd like to, have those data stored in InfoEd for some reason, report purposes, or to be able to transfer it from there to some other system, perhaps. So I think that's an institution-specific kind of question. Looks like Shauna has something to add.
Thanks, Roger. I really appreciate it. So I think what we're hearing from funders is that they would really like to see organizations that employ researchers to write the employment data to ORCID profiles so they can see that trusted check mark. They're really looking more for trust and transparency in science. And unfortunately, there are applicants for funding who claim to be working for an organization, but it's not true. And so they really do want to see that green check mark. It really is valuable to them. We've also heard the same thing from publishers. So if LSU and some of the other universities out there could write employment to the ORCID record, that will really help your researchers build a trustworthy profile that will be really helpful to help move their applications forward with the funders and publishers. So just to quickly add what Roger was saying there.
Yeah, no, and I didn't mean to suggest that I don't think that they should do that. I think for those folks that are listening that are InfoEd clients, and this really is speaking mostly to them because they'll have a sense of what this means more. At most institutions, there are controls available for what sections of a user's InfoEd profile can be managed by the user. And historically, institutions have taken all kinds of different approaches to whether they allow whether investigators see sections like the employment or the education section of their profile at all, whether they can edit those data. And so at some institutions, they may have put all their employment history into the profile, or all of their educational history information into the profile. And if that's the case, then the institution will want to give some thought to the implications. If all of those institutions are, have ROR mappings, then LSU, just using them as an example, would be asserting the entire employment or educational history of a person, even though LSU may not really want to assert all of that historical information. So that's when I was saying they may want to engage in some cleanup of data in profiles before they are prepared to start asserting LSU or other institutional employment data or educational data into ORCID profiles. And that's really ultimately why we've given them that granular control, so that they could, for example, turn on the funding information push sooner, and then decide how to get things cleaned up and ready to go on the for education or employment information.
And if I could just add one thing, our office, in the Office of Research, we are not the source of truth, so to speak, for employment. That really resides in our HR system. And I know that our HR system, that if they haven't already made those kinds of integrations, that's certainly something we would want to see, whether it's through our faculty reporting system. I know that these things are getting tied together. I don't know the full status of that, in part because I'm not in academic affairs. But that would be, for us, we would feel more confident if that information was managed by HR through our HR system, rather than from within our implementation of ERA. We trust that system for information, and so that would be the pathway that I think that would be best suited. That we have multiple channels feeding into ORCID from their different sources.
Yeah, and
you can certainly do that, but it's also important to remember that there's direct integration from the institutional HR system into InfoEd. So that data can be passed from the HR system to InfoEd, and then InfoEd serve as a sort of a pass-through to be able to assert the data to ORCID, rather than necessarily setting up an entirely separate integration. So either of those pathways is fine, but absolutely, I think institutions will want to rely on the, their institutional source of truth for those bits of data, one way or another, for sure.
Right, and to follow up on what Steve just said, that the libraries work, and that's why we're only focusing on the work section, because as librarians, that is where we're the authority. But if we can get this integration with that we're working on with our IT folks working for the work section, I could see a possible building onto that, so that, maybe ORCID could update the funding section if that is something they wanted to do, or our HR department could update the employment section. Not something that we're planning now, but that would be a possible next step.
Well, thank you. I love how that question evolved, and appreciate everyone jumping in on there. I think we have time for one more question. We do have some other outstanding questions, but for those that haven't been answered yet, I will share with the speakers so we can get answers and share them with you when we share the recording and the material. So don't worry, we will answer all questions that are still open. But our final question is, does InfoEd have the ability to pull data into the research COI forms from ORCID?
So, yes, it's a little complicated to answer that, but potentially, it would involve using another module that most of our clients don't have today. It's our other support module, which does have access to information in other support. But it also depends a little bit on what section of the ORCID profile that you would want to put the data into. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just leave it at that. But whoever's asking that question must be an InfoEd client. So I would encourage them to just reach out to me separately, and we can have a more specific and fruitful conversation for you.
All right. Well, thank you, Roger. Again, there are a few outstanding questions, but I'll follow up with the speaker so we can get answers to those questions, and we'll share that with the material follow-up sometime next week. I want to thank Roger, Dr. Beck, and Sigrid for joining me today for this session. We really appreciate your time. Also want to thank all of our participants for joining us, and I hope to see you all at a future ORCID event. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.